Follows the collapse of the Old Kingdom and the chaos that will follow and civil war until Egypt is reunited in the Middle Kingdom, and then we will turn our attention to the early New Kingdom when we have the first female pharaoh of any of the dynasties.
The Middle Kingdom would come after the collapse of the Old Kingdom and over a century and a half of warfare in order to establish who the new ruler would be. The so-called First Intermediate Period of 2175 to 1975 BCE is between the Old and the Middle Kingdom. In this era, we find a decline in the authority of the kings that was celebrated earlier in this pharaonic understanding of rule. And now provincial nobles take their power back in the areas in Upper and Lower Egypt. We already see the decline in the pharaoh's power in 2332 to 2287 BCE with King Pepe I's tombs that were made of mud brick rather than stone. Now, at this time, the Egyptians also lose control of Nubia, which is their primary gold repository and is going to be where most gold in the Middle East is derived from. Now, something also happened to the pantheon at this time. Significantly, Osiris, who has green skin relating that he is the god of agriculture, is now going to be linked with the dead. So we see the seated statue of King Pepe I here to the right with the riding crop and the shepherd's crook crossed over his chest, just as Osiris would now in the underworld, judging, and people would be led to him to judge. Now, how in the Last Judgment scenes we have in ancient Egypt people would be judged would also relate to another understanding of justice that develops in this era. It would be in the Middle Kingdom that the concept of Mot is developed, or harmony that is achieved through justice, and she is embodied by the goddess Mot, a winged goddess much like an angelic figure in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and is shown with a feather on her head. It would be this feather that one's heart would be weighed against at the Last Judgment before being presented to Osiris, the god of the underworld. The Middle Kingdom would be reunited, that being Upper and Lower Egypt, under Nebheptari-Mentuhotep in 2010 BCE of the 11th dynasty. He moves the capital to Thebes, and this will remain a very important capital in the New Kingdom. As well, he strengthens the military strength and reach of the Egyptians, expanding back down into Lower Nubia, where these gold repositories and mines actually are, thus providing wealth to pay for military endeavors. And he's going to also have a new type of burial, which is more common in the Middle Kingdom, that also showcases a lack of resources. He's buried in a cliff face. Here at Thebes, as in other areas of Egypt, we can see how quickly the irrigated agricultural area will give way to the mountainous, craggy cliff sides of this desert. And it is in these rocky outcroppings and cliffs that the pharaohs in the Middle Kingdom would build their tombs. Because the finances were unavailable for the massive tombs such as were built in Giza for Khafre, Khufu, and Menkaure, we now look to hollow out from solid bedrock the tomb structures themselves. The 11th and 12th dynasties find that the hollowing out of the face of a cliff, otherwise known as rock-cut tombs, are going to be distinctive and will leave their mark on the burials of Egyptian pharaohs moving into the New Kingdom, for they would all have the actual burial cut directly into a cliff face and into rock. At Beni Hassan, we have an example of that. Beni Hassan in Egypt today, as in antiquity, we would have a very rocky, solid quarry area that was ripe for engineering and to shape this to look more like the entrance of a temple and to house the pharaoh and the pharaoh's loved ones. Here at Beni Hassan in the 12th dynasty, we have the front of this temple portico with chamfered pillars in this colonnade, cut as though we are entering into a structure that is assembled, yet it is all cut out of solid rock. The portico leads to a main hall and a shrine with the burial chamber behind it, and these were only for the ruling families, we find, the wealthiest members of Egyptian society. So the design, much like the serdab in the middle of a mastaba tomb, is retained from the Old Kingdom, but instead of assembling the materials and quarrying them and placing them in another area, they are now going to just be taking solid rock and cutting into it. Here we have the interior of the rock-cut tomb at Beni Hassan. This one, produced between 1938 and 1756 BCE, shows the columns and how they are constructed. For one at the back right is going to be missing its central section, thus showing that instead of building them up sequentially and held up by gravity, they are instead just cut from and hewn from solid rock. Then plaster is used to decorate the interior, as they would have been in the Old Kingdom. Now, the idea of columns, much like we saw at Saqqara and the stepped pyramid, developed slowly in Egypt. And so, by the Middle Kingdom, we find the Egyptians realized that a circular column would stand up on its own and did not need to be attached to a wall, as earlier engineers had thought was necessary. The hardship the pharaohs faced in the Middle Kingdom can be seen in examples like the head of Senuseret III here from the 12th dynasty, produced between 1836 and 1818 BCE. Now this is carved of yellow quartzite, which is not as expensive a material as the diorite or schist that we saw previously in the Old Kingdom pyramids of Giza. Here we have a pharaoh with a Nimmy's headdress that is going to be on, a pharaoh who is known to be a good administrator, leading more military expeditions into Nubia to secure great resources and wealth for the Egyptians. Now, looking at the figure from the side as it misses its nose, we can see the hardship on the pharaoh's face here.
Now, if we compare the portrait here to an earlier one like Cameronebti and Menkaure, we find that the pharaohs are going to maintain a fairly consistent iconographic convention by way of the dimensions of the face, say the height of the ears, the almond-shaped eyes, the pursed lips, and then we still maintain and carry on that headdress, that Nimmy's headdress, that is a linen wrap around the head, which makes him look like a cobra. Now we're going to reveal, however, if we compare him to earlier pharaohs, the true hardship that is taking place and is wearing on rulers, much like the portraits of Roman emperors in the late period, in the late empire, where we begin revealing the effect and the war weariness on these individuals. They are no longer the perfect deified gods who do not feel, who are invincible. Now we see his eyes sunken in. We find bags under them. We find this worried look, a line marking his brow. All of these indicators of what's happening at the time. Now, additionally, what we find in the Middle Kingdom is that appended to the Nimmy's headdress, we now have an actual uraeus cobra of kingship placed around the band. So this is the next step until we reach the final version of the pharaonic headdress with the later New Kingdom.
As is made clear in the materials used for the effigy of Senuseret, there are few large-scale effigies in precious materials from the Middle Kingdom, such as the diorite we discussed with the seated statue of Khafre. However, there are abundant stelae that are produced, or these relief sculptures that mark an event or a grave. Here in the stele of Amenemhet, we have a late 11th dynasty stele that is painted and polychromed from around 2000 BCE. This is going to be produced for a vizier, or the modern day understanding of a prime minister, who set up the 12th dynasty as pharaoh, overthrowing the previous pharaoh and moving this capital to Memphis in the south. Here we have the stele showing the funerary rites and rituals that one would carry out in one's tomb. He is seated on a lion throne along with his son and wife, who are going to be embracing one another, much like the lion throne seen in the seated statue of Khafre, for lions relate to Amun-Ra and kingship. The inscription above them in hieroglyphics is going to state that food is requested as offerings, and so we have this table with jugs and piled high with meat and other edibles that are going to be in front of Amenet. Here we have the unfinished version showing how common they are, even at the St. Louis Art Museum, as people are going to be presented these offerings by their living relatives. And then in turn, we very often would see the person presented him or herself to Osiris in the underworld at the apex of these reliefs. At the far left, we have the wife with one exposed breast, Iei, who is going to be embracing Amenemhet and his son, who look at one another almost as a mirror image. And in front of them, we have the offering table, while the daughter of Amenemhet, Hapi, is going to be at the far right, holding her arm or her hand over her heart. Now, this is a convention that will carry through with the Minoans, the ancient Greeks, and Romans, in that the men are shown as dark and reddish brown and ruddy in color, whereas the women are shown with a light yellow ochre color, because they are not going to be engaged in activities which are outdoors, thus they are not as tan. And so this is a primary way to differentiate the genders in antiquity. So the Middle Kingdom, turning to the 13th dynasty, was weakened by very short-lived kings, and so we have an influx of foreigners from the delta here in the upper northeast section of the country, especially those like the Hittites. Conquering the native rulers, the second intermediate period is going to be dominated by the Hyksos, as the Egyptians call them, or shepherd kings, foreigners that come from outside of Egypt. The New Kingdom would be established in 1539, and the 18th dynasty, the first of those in the New Kingdom, to regain control, giving control back to native rulers once again.
Now, Thutmose III is going to be the stepson of the first female pharaoh, Hatshepsut. Here we find that he will extend the kingdom to the Mediterranean and all the way to Syria. Now, he is the first pharaoh to call himself as such, the term pharaoh meaning the great house. So the ruler now stands in for the ruling family and the great house of Egypt. Now we find that here at Deir el-Bahri, we have a massive monument that is going to show us how the new kingdom will be quite different than the old kingdom. For the great monuments of the old kingdom, such as the pyramids of Giza, are the large remnants of the tombs of these pharaohs, not their temples. The small temples were dwarfed in front of each one of these tombs. Now this will be the opposite in the new kingdom.
The opposite is true in the New Kingdom, where the temples are going to be the dominant motif in what is visible, whereas the tombs are going to be inset within the cliff face, as in the Middle Kingdom in the rock-cut tombs. Here we have Sinmet, the chancellor and possibly the lover of Hatshepsut, designing her great funerary temple. The rumors of this queen who did not remarry after the death of her husband were only fueled and are going to be spread by graffiti that is going to be found.
Now, Hatshepsut is going to be the fourth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. She is the queen and half-sister of Thutmose II. Now, this is how she is able to gain power for herself as the first female pharaoh in history. In 1479 BCE, she will be named regent for Thutmose III, a son by a minor wife, not her son, when he was 12 years old. Thus, he was going to be too young to rule, so we need to put someone in charge until he comes of age, usually around 18 years of age. Only we find that Hatshepsut is going to rule much longer than they intended, a few years. She rules for nearly a decade and a half here. Obviously, we find that she needs an argument and a series of images as propaganda to promote her as the official regent, seeing the true potential of her stepson, here shown very often holding him, even though he was already 12 years old at the time, but reinforcing this notion that she is protecting the future pharaoh.
Please take a moment after this lecture to watch Hatshepsut's Engineering an Empire, specifically the 10 minutes between 50 and an hour after through the documentary, which details the construction of this monumental project.
Eventually, she will give up on trying to be the regent and then name herself, start calling herself Pharaoh. And so if you're going to be a pharaoh, you need to build like one. And that's what we see here in a massive series of ramped colonnaded terraces that originally had very lush gardens, which would be significant and stand out because we are in a desert here at Dir el-Bahri. So we find this is very much like the environment where the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were created, because of course we have to irrigate these areas and bring in exotic plants from other parts of the kingdom. In this case, an expedition that the queen went on. Now here, the temple is going to be much larger, but still modeled on an earlier temple of Mentuhotep II, thus tying herself to a distinguished earlier pharaoh, using the same plan for the temple and merely expanding it, making it much larger. So here we have the ruins on the other side of her temple of what this is based on. Now, the cliffs behind the temple, given the verticality of the columns that she includes, are meant to relate to the permanence and stability of the mountain itself, because, of course, her rule is very unstable, being the first female pharaoh, and so she needs to convince people of the fact that she will always be pharaoh, that she will always be the official ruler of Egypt, the incarnation of Horus, and her father being Amun-Ra. She even states clearly that she wishes her titulary to abide like the mountains. When the sun shines, its rays are bright upon the titulary of my majesty. My Horus is high upon the standard forever. Thus, of course, her divinity is going to be reminded of here looking at this temple and is going to be as permanent as her incarnation as a god. Now, the columns that are used here show us how far the Egyptians have progressed in their knowledge of architecture. For unlike the stepped pyramid at Djoser and the attached columns there, now they are freestanding. The Egyptians realize they will stand up on their own. And here we find they are not fully in the round, but are beveled or angled on the sides. Hence, we have chamfered pillars, which will, of course, make up this post and lintel system in the front of this temple that gives you the vertical elements, much like the striations in the temple above and the mountains behind, and will be the model for early Greek architecture to come nearly 1,000 years later. Now, the inscriptions on the inside of her temple are going to herald her and hold her up as a great leader. For she is a woman, and even in Egyptian custom, whereby she might have been made pharaoh, but women are not allowed to go into battle. Therefore, she could not claim to be a great military leader. But she still needs to extend the boundaries of the Egyptian empire. So she puts together an expedition to go to the land of Punt on the Red Sea outside of Egypt and brings back plants and animals from there and plants them in front of her very temple. Here we see people carrying these uprooted trees and sailing back from this land of Punt. In the front of the temple, leading to this ceremonial avenue of sphinxes, we have guardian figures, and just like the earlier pharaohs of Giza and at Karnak, we will see that sphinxes are the preferred Egyptian guardian figure to ward off evil and to protect the deified dead. So leading up to these massive ramps that we can see from 1,000 yards away, there is no surprise coming in the Egyptian design here. We would have to walk past dozens of these images of Hatshepsut as a sphinx. And here we have one of these standard images where her face is going to remain human, but her body is that of a lion, while she is still wearing the striated Nimi's headdress and the false beard, thus communicating that she is the cobra of kingship and that she still wears the strap-on beard, the ceremonial beard that all pharaohs do. Now you'll notice in the sphinxes, they keep the tradition going back to the largest sculpture from antiquity, that being the Great Sphinx with the face of Menkaure on it at Giza. Now did, once again, Menkaure's Great Sphinx originally have a false beard as we see here? Perhaps, we do not know. There are several theories. But what we should take note of is how Hatshepsut is going to not show herself distinctly as a woman in most of these, but will minimize her femininity to maximize her association with earlier models of male pharaohs, thus giving her the same authority as a man. Now this can also be seen in many sculptures that were smashed and destroyed at the end of her rule, and then her temple buried and forgotten. Now these sculptures very often showed the pharaoh in a male guise, holding globular offering jars. Now approximately 200 of these statues would have been smashed and dug into and dumped into a massive pit next to the temple. Now, when reassembling them, we can see that she is appealing to a very clever strategy to reinforce her own divinity. For priests would often use incense-burning globular offering jars to honor the god Amun-Ra, the creator god. Now, Hatshepsut, in these reliefs and engravings inside of the temple and inscribed on her statues, claims to be the daughter of Amun-Ra, and we even see images in the temple of Amun-Ra making love to her mother, and then Hatshepsut being born, showing that she is a direct descendant of the creator god, as are all other pharaohs. Now we know that we find pharaohs would not kneel before any other mortal, so she must be worshiping and kneeling before her father, the chief god Amun-Ra. Now here we have many different guises that she is in, again holding globular offering jars and kneeling before her divine father, and even using again a masculine pronoun to describe her as him very often in these inscriptions. So in some of the images, we do find the pharaoh does accept her femininity and shows herself with breasts, but even then, she keeps the iconographic convention of the Nimi's headdress. So here we find that the way in which individuals can recognize who a pharaoh is, just as today we have certain markers for what someone in power would wear, and so we can identify them easily. So too did the ancient Egyptians understand this linen headdress, this false beard, this cobra on the top of the headdress on the mantle here, all of which are codes for iconographic conventions for understanding what a pharaoh is. Even in the positioning of her body, the makeup and musculature of it, and then her dress. For you notice here that she is shown as a he. She is shirtless, she is wearing a kilt, and has, again, the male torso that's going to be established in the Old Kingdom that we saw with examples like the seated statue of Khafre, and once again the standing statue of Menkaure. So this just shows us that if she were to be taken seriously, she had to adopt the same symbolism, the same markers that communicated power earlier for pharaohs before her.
As is evidenced not only by the broken statues, but the imagery within the temple. We find Hatshepsut disappears from the historical record in 1458 BCE. Thutmose III, her stepson, reinstated as pharaoh at 27 years old, had her name and effigy erased from every monument, much as the Romans would later on through the Damnatio Memoriae. This means that the individual could not reincarnate and be reborn in the next world, a horrible punishment for someone to be afflicted with.
At the same time, across the river in Thebes, the capital, we have very exciting activities in tomb decoration showing us a new direction and forecasting that something is about to change in the new kingdom, because we see relaxing conventions. Here we find Nebamun hunting birds in the tomb of Nebamun in Thebes from 1390 to 1352 BCE. Now, in his tomb, we find there are generally only two types of decorations, that relating to agriculture and hunting to be common in ancient Egypt. In this case, we find that hunting is illustrated, showing us what he is doing in his eternal afterlife. Now, this is painted in fresco secco, which is painted on dry lime plaster, appropriate for Egypt because it must stay out of the sunlight and away from moisture. So desert tombs are perfect for this technique, which allows a great amount of detail, such as the fur on the cat, or the scales on the fish, or the feathers on these birds. Now we know that, thanks to the hieroglyphic decoration behind him, that he is a scribe and counter of grain, having a very important job in ancient Egypt to record and then distribute grain production to the peoples. Here we find that behind him, the hieroglyphics tell us that Nebamun is enjoying recreation in his eternal afterlife. So generally, whatever is illustrated in a scene will be also elaborated on in the hieroglyphics. Now, in the hierarchy of scale, we find that Nebamun is much larger than his wife directly behind him and his daughter below him. He is taking part in an activity that he would have in his life given his station, which is recreational hunting. However, this goes beyond recreational sport into the allegorical, because just as hippopotamus hunts, which are going to reenact the hunting scenes that reference Horus hunting his father's murderer, Seth, we still have that carried out here. That's how we celebrate the victory of justice over vice that Horus won, and so we also hunt on the Nile. Now, the active pose is traditionally reserved only for pharaohs when it comes to this particular one. Naturalism is generally only common in the lower classes, whereas with T watching hippopotamus hunt, his servants who are nude are doing the actual hunting. He is stationary and immobile. This is going to take its cue from those early images of pharaohs with the right arm raised. In this case, the mirror reverse, we find Nebamun has his left arm raised, about to strike three birds he has grasped with his right hand. Whereas the pharaoh would be striking down an enemy with his right hand held by his left with the hair of the enemy. Now, this relaxing of conventions is going to tell us that things are already changing in ancient Egypt.
Along with scenes of hunting and agriculture, we also often have scenes of dancing. Here we have musicians at the left who play musical instruments and clap, as dancers to the right are going to be dancing in front of this elaborate presentation to the dead in the same tomb for Nebamun. This is a commemorative banquet that shows once a year family who are surviving the dead loved one would come to the tomb and commune with the dead, leaving beer, food, and dancing and playing music to entertain them and celebrate them. Now, Spencer is going to argue in the article on music and dance that these activities are sacred to the goddess Hathor, who aided in the passage of the dead. Here at the left, noble women are going to be playing reeds while the two girls dance, referencing rebirth, fertility, and regeneration. Obviously, as in tea and hippopotamus hunt, this could be understood in two ways. One, literally, people, as would be hunting, would also carry out this commemorative banquet, but also the notion that the whole point of the afterlife for the Egyptians and these tombs is to be reborn and continue living. Hence, these references to fertility, sexuality, and regeneration are necessary. Along with the relaxing conventions seen with Nebamoon hunting birds, if we compare this to earlier tomb decoration, we see that the overlapping of the noble women and the dancers in their frontal poses are relaxing the convention, which was fairly strict previously, with the same figures in conventional poses repeated one after another. This foretells a schism that will happen in ancient Egypt in the New Kingdom, for the temples and the priests within them become rivals to the pharaohs. This is also what happens to kings and the clergy in the Middle Ages. So Amenhotep III begins distancing himself from both the capital of Thebes and Karnak, where we have the worship of all of the pantheon, or all of the Egyptian gods, where the priesthood has the greatest power and influence.
Now, in the middle of the 14th century BCE, where we left off last time, we have a religious revolution when the capital will move, uprooting everyone who is around the royal court and depends on it, from Thebes, and moves it to what is at the time a desert in the middle of nowhere, Tel El Amarna today, but is renamed Akhenaten after the new king who decides to move the capital. The new capital included not only a new palace and pylon temple for religious worship for a new type of religion, but also all of the necessary additional structures for the vizier, for the army, for the priests, and other individuals associated with the royal court.
Following his father's lead, Amenhotep IV, who changes his name to Akhenaten, will rule for 18 years and abandon the worship of all of the old gods except for Aton, who is the sexless sun disk that travels through the sky at the behest of Amun-Ra. He also changes his name to associate himself with this new god and puts together Akhenaten, or that he is the living spirit of Aton, the one true god, and the direct mediator for the god that would ultimately cut out the priesthood altogether. No one else but him mediates with the gods. This is not unusual, for those of the Old Kingdom, like Menkaure and Khafre, also brought together the name of the god with their own name. As with the Assyrians and those in the ancient Near East, this is very common, for it relates a ruler to the deity that is protecting them. What he did next was erase all the gods from the temples and attacked Amun. He built first the temple to Aton in Thebes, but it was too close to Karnak and too close to the old priesthood. So that's why he moves the capital to Akhenaten in the middle of the desert.
The god that he is referring to is the actual disk of the sun that previously Amun-Ra had controlled and created out of the bin that arose from the primordial waters at the beginning of time. Now, this disk was just an object, the sun that moves across the sky, much like Helios and his relationship to Apollo in the Greco-Roman religion. Now, if we look at the representation of Aton, we can see why there will be a new style developed in order to record what he will look like and what his followers look like. Because before, the standard imagery for Egyptian gods is going to be an anthropomorphic one. That being on the right here, you see the gods next to this man, and they have male features and or a human body with animal normal heads that are indicative of what they are responsible for, such as Horus, in this instance, having a falcon head.
The style that defines this new approach is one of androgyny and is called the Amarna style for the Amarna period. So here, like the androgynous sun disk Aton, who is genderless, sexless, does not have male or female parts of representation, we find that the representations of the royal family are likewise androgynous, having both effeminate and masculine traits to them. Here we show Akhenaten as both Osiris and as Horus, with the combined white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt that we discussed, from the cobra and the vulture goddess brought together, showing he unites the kingdoms and rules both.
So this is going to be relatively straightforward at this point. Pharaohs are going to show themselves as Osiris in the underworld because they are going to, after transitioning to the next life, take on that role after they battle Apophis, the worm that would eat the sun on the night leading into the next morning. However, if we compare Akhenaten to earlier standing types of pharaohs, we see the radical departure that his artists have taken here, in that he is fairly attenuated and stretched out. And in addition, we notice these protruding hips, these luscious large lips, almond-shaped eyes, and of course the hands will nearly always cover the chest, so we cannot identify him as having either pectoral muscles or breasts. Thus we have this androgynous approach to the decorative elements here and the design. So this androgyny is going to demand a type of feminization of the male form. He's rather effeminate and womanly in many ways, having these soft curving contours, a long face with full lips, a protruding belly, and finally the wide female hips. So this is going to have led some archaeologists to the conclusion that perhaps he actually looked this way and had a hormonal imbalance or disorder which caused him to take on feminine features. However, if we compare it to the earlier types, we still are retaining the iconographic conventions for a pharaoh, in which we have the Nemes headdress, we have the false beard, the uraeus cobra of kingship being associated with it, and still roughly the same proportions from the ratio of the ears to the overall face. That has not changed, only it has become more effeminate.
The question remains debated among scholars, especially archaeologists and art historians. Are we here reacting against an older style, thus rebelling against an old pantheon by using this new androgynous style? Or did he actually look this way, with this physiological illness like Klinefelter syndrome, where we have androgen insensitivity syndrome, and he would, as a man, grow breasts, for instance, and or grow more effeminate features? We do not know, but the same style is accorded to the whole family, so it is a uniform application of a style that is unique to this period.
Now, to answer that question, we need to look at the rest of the family. And we note that the same features can be found throughout all of them. Here, his wife, the bust of Nefertiti, we get a good indication as to how universal this Amarna style actually was and how it was applied to many different figures in the period. Now, the style being so influential, it's going to show Nefertiti here as the attenuated, graceful, and soft, effeminate, curving features, and the same as her husband. She's often shown the same height and wearing the same headdresses as her husband Akhenaten, who often regarded her in inscriptions as an equal shareholder in power. Here we have the portrait bust seen from the left-hand side because it is unfinished, found in a workshop when it was abandoned. The city was abandoned and it moved back to Thebes at the end of this era. That's why she does not have a left eye. Now, Nefertiti's name means the beautiful one is here, and everyone agreed that she was quite beautiful. That being captured in the elegant, royal, and sophisticated representation of the queen here, which makes sense if we compare it to her husband. Looking at both of them side by side, we start to notice the same features, the elongation or attenuation, the curvilinear forms that are going to sweep around the figure quite gracefully and in an effeminate way, with the full and pouting lips being the final touch to this rather androgynous style.
Other members of the family, such as Queen Tai, the mother of Akhenaten, and the chief and principal wife of Amenhotep III, his father, is going to show how we are going to take existing portraits and modify them after this new religion is adopted. For here we have yew wood, which matches the complexion of the queen with this dark brown color. And then the rest are polychromed and painted to look as naturalistic as possible. She originally would have had a headdress relating her to the goddess Hathor, but now has this hair placed over it in order to distance her from the previous pantheon. What is interesting here is the fact that it is polychromed and naturalistic was generally reserved previously only for those of lower social rank, like the seated scribe we've discussed and butchers. So this shows also the relaxing of conventions and how someone can be shown in the royal family as such now.
Now the question still remains, did they look like this? And we can definitively state no, because the style is used for the entire household. Here we find that Akhenaten and Nefertiti only had daughters. They did not have a son, which leads to the struggle for power at his death. But when we look at the images of his daughters, we notice they have the same type of graceful elongation, in many cases showing a bulbous protrusion off the back of their head. This leads to the question, did they practice head binding in ancient Egypt? Because other cultures did, such as Peruvian cultures and those in Africa, to where a child's skull is going to be fusing in the early years of life. So if you put a board on either side and tie it, you can elongate the skull to get a different type of shape to the skull, which was seen as divine and or aesthetically pleasing to different cultures. Looking at the mummies, though, of this family, they did not look like this. They did not practice head binding. Therefore, it is a style that is meant to indicate the shift that we have in ancient Egypt to a new religion. Here we have another painting of the daughters. Standard for ancient Egyptian culture, girls would wear no shirt but a long series of necklaces that would cover their chest until they reached puberty. Now, in the stele here from Tel El Amarna, we have a very unusual scene for ancient Egypt. For we see the pharaoh, his chief wife and queen, and their daughters engaged in a rather candid family portrait, exchanging and embracing one another affectionately. So in this sunken relief, not unlike what we looked at the Temple of Abu Simbel from Ramses II and at Karnak, we have a negative relief in which we are cutting into the stone to cast these deep shadows and contours, much like we have cut it out with a cookie cutter. Now here we have Aton in the center, that sun disk, which is the only god that Egyptians are allowed to worship under Akhenaten, who is going to be giving eternal life to the royal family. Little hands come out from the rays of the sun and are holding ankhs, the symbols of eternal life, as Akhenaten on the left is going to be seated just slightly higher than his chief queen, the beautiful one is here, or Nefertiti on the right, but they are shown very similarly. They both are going to have two billowing ribbons coming off the back of their head. Their pharaonic headgear looks very similar. Both of them wear a uraeus cobra of kingship. And then their bodies and the type is also similar, in which we have the large flowing hips and protruding abdomen, the small shoulders and elongated neck, and the large protruding lips and the soft curvilinear features of the face. Looking closely, we can see the hands reaching out and putting these ankhs right under the noses and the mouths of these figures. So the chief god is blessing this family, and we see them exchanging affectionate embraces and even kisses, which is entirely unheard of in royal portraits prior to this point. Now, because we have a new religion, we are now relaxing the conventions that would have only allowed pharaohs to be shown rigidly standing upward and or seated at a right angle. Now, in a relaxed fashion, they interact and engage with one another. We do not see the rigid, immobile, and permanent god-like features earlier used to describe and to portray pharaohs. Now we have a loving family man, father, and husband.
As one can imagine, the issue with Akhenaten's move to Amarna is that the isolationist policy is going to ignore everything outside of the city. He was only concerned with the area inside the massive walls that, seen here, form the boundaries of Amarna and are going to chronicle that Aten is the god protecting it. With growing discontent among the populace elsewhere in Egypt and the old priestly class wanting their power back, once the pharaoh dies in 1336 BCE, we find a grab for power is going to occur. After the reign of Akhenaten's statues are going to be destroyed, considered to be heretical, worshiping a god that does not consider the rest of the pantheon. And so, after his death, worship of all of the pantheon resumes at Karnak, and the capital moves back to Thebes across the Nile. So remember to watch the period relating to Akhenaten and the Amarna period, which is 10 minutes, an hour, and then an hour and 10 from Engineering an Empire right after this video. Next class, we will continue by looking at the later New Kingdom and the son of Akhenaten through the fall of ancient Egypt.